Hello Crazyhouse chess fans, and welcome to today's game between Tornon against one of the top Crazyhouse players, Red 2700 plus Cren, who actually very recently got over 2700. And he decided to play a very untheoretical system against Tornon, who was a very sharp player who had a lot of problems playing against in the past. And after d4, knight f6, I think that the way in which white should try to punish this delayed d5, which black would normally play with French, is to go for the move e5 here. Because usually black is going to play this with some sort of idea of sacking the knight. But black doesn't really get enough compensation when he can't take back with the e-pawn. For example, after gf6, white go knight c3. And have ideas like putting a pawn into d5. Or if black were to stop that, then even a move like bishop d3 is quite fine. Or knight at h5. You know, if black does put a pawn on g4, you kind of just take it and say you've got a lot more space than the opponent. But instead, white played very passively with knight d2. And while this would be a decent move in normal chess, in general in Crazyhouse chess, the knight is a lot better on c3 or c6 than d2 or d7, especially in the 1e4 lines. So after d5, white played bishop d3, which is fine, but I think that e5 is probably a better attempt to punish the move order, where after the move knight c6, you don't always want to play bishop d3, because there is sometimes a risk that black will be able to sack and put a pawn on e4, but here I think it actually makes sense, where after knight g4, you can castle here, and I find that black's different piece sack ideas don't really work that well here. For example, you could play knight d4, and this is quite a thematic option, in order to sack a piece to get 2 pawns in a strong center. White also gets a very big lead in development, which also does count for something in Crazyhouse. After a move like rook e1 even, I think that this sort of position is very, very strong for white, where white is going to bring the pieces out very actively, and then eventually get the drops he needs in order to get the king in the center. But instead, white played bishop d3, which also does make some sense, because after d4 and knight e4, well, obviously, if you were to compare this to a normal Rubinstein French, well, certainly bishop d3 is much more useful than the move pawn at a6. That being said, I think that here black could have considered a move like knight takes e4, and then after takes the move knight at d6, which does at least have ideas that if the bishop were to move away, you can drop a pawn on e4 and have a quite annoying fork, which something a lot of club players fall for in Crazyhouse. So a better attempt for white might be something like knight at g5, but then in that case, after knight takes c4, knight e4, and bishop g6, well, black has quite a solid position on the light squares, where the bishop on g6 is a very good defender of the weak point on f7. I think that with moves like knight c6, bishop d7, and potentially dropping something on e4 or g4, black will definitely get chances to pressure the center in these kind of positions. So it's good for white, but it's very far from over. Instead, black played knight c6, and well, I think that white's move was perfectly fine with castles. If he did want to try and punish black for his wasted time, the more aggressive approach is to go knight f6, and then to put the knight on h5 with ideas of dropping a white pawn on g7 and just weakening those dark squares for black. And if black does try to stop that with pawn at g7, well, even just simply castling is fine, where black really misses a pawn drop on g4 and later h3 in order to go after the center and after the white king. So white's kind of able to develop steadily and just say that black really has a hard time getting the pieces developed, which means that objectively this isn't really a playable position for black. Instead, white played the move castles, and we had the move rook g8. It's worth pointing out, by the way, for those who are wondering, well, what happens if black were to play knight takes d4? Because actually in a bullet game, knight d4 would be quite a tricky move, because the opponent might think that after knight d4 and queen d4, the white simply blundered the queen, the black simply blundered the queen to the tactic bishop b5. But actually, it turns out if you play this, even though it would win in normal chess, it corresponds to, in Crazyhouse, to actually white who blundered. Because after queen d4, we have this very nice fork of knight at e2 that wins back the queen and is just completely decisive. So the correct way to punish the move queen d4 is to use your lead in development and the fact the center is open, playing knight takes f6, queen f6. And now there are a lot of good moves for white, but the computer points out a very beautiful idea in knight at b6 that kind of ensures that you're going to get that bishop on c8, that's a very important defender for the pawn at d7 check to lure the black king into the center. And if they do play cb6, you've got knight c7. And we see that the king is forced into the open. Also, now white gets the rook in hand, and black just have that time to drop all his pieces on the board, whereas white can put a pawn on c7. You know, the rook can even come to f4 for the defense if need be, and white just has a winning advantage due to the king's safety here. So I move rook g8 is by comparison, well, it's sort of a creative attempt, saying, well, if you take on f6, I'll take with a g-pawn and I get an attack on the king, which is a very standard idea in these lines. And I think if I was playing white, I think the move that really makes rook g8 look kind of ridiculous is the move knight e g5, which actually is a very standard idea in these positions, just to sack on f7 and open up the black king, because of course f7 is a major weak point in Crazyhouse in general. Or even a move like knight at e5 and just trading off the knights so you can get the knight in hand to drop on g5 after later sack on f7. Yeah, there are a few good approaches, but I do think that black's position doesn't really make sense, and white would be completely winning here. Instead, I played bishop g5, and I feel like even though it's not a terrible move, that it does justify black's play quite a bit more, because now bishop knight f6 does open up the rook. Actually, it turns out that technically speaking, actually knight f6 is a good move, for some very concrete tactical reasons, that after the move gf6, we can actually play bishop h7, and it's a very instructive variation for guys showing how powerful the pawns can be to drop on the 7th rank. Because after rook g7, bishop e4, if black were to take the bishop, which is certainly the most obvious move, it turns out pawn at h6 is just absolutely crushing. Actually, pawn at h7 is not so bad either, but this is even more effective, because after rook g8, well, now you can even play a move like pawn to h7, and we see that black just isn't able to stop the pawn queening, basically. If rook h8, just pawn at g7, and one of these pawns is going to queen one way or another. Actually, it's a very instructive example for showing why you often don't want to make too many pawn moves in Crazyhouse, because then you leave yourself very vulnerable to these kind of drops on the 7th rank, and the pawn just becoming a queen all of a sudden. But white didn't see this idea. Instead, he played the move of pawn at e5, which to be fair is still a reasonable approach, but after knight takes e4, well, I guess the idea is that after bishop takes, and if black were to play, say, queen e7, trying to cover this f6 point, well, I can still play moves like bishop takes c6, drop a bishop on h4, and very often he's going to be able to just drop something on f6 and just basically completely dominate on the dark squares where black is very much weak. So black decided to play the move g4, kind of almost a swindling kind of move, just try and make the position as complicated as possible here. So after g4, I think again in this position white should play e takes f6, because g takes f3 and fe7. Well, obviously white's picking up a lot of material, so black's idea I think was to play gf6 and to try to, well, create some complications with the attacks on these different pieces. But there are a few good ways in which you can deal with it. The one I think is the most clinical is just to play knight at h6, where we now do a counterattack on the rook. It shows just how tactical these variants are, because, well, if you're able to play knight takes g4, clearly that sort of neutralizes the attack on the king side. But if you play something like rook takes g5, white will take... I mean, you can see white's just up in material, and with a rook at g8, pawn at g7, well, white's going to have a decisive attack against the black king, which is too exposed, and once again, black doesn't find the time to get all the drops he needs to consolidate the position. So instead, though, white kind of lost his way around this point. I mean, the move knight f6 is still good enough, but after gf6, I think, again, he probably, after ef6 and bishop f6, this is really a big turning point, where in the other positions, white definitely was winning in more than one way, but now I think white has to be a little bit more precise. And in this position, actually, there's a very creative idea pointed out by the engine that it's I find it's very easy to forget for human players, but it's one that sort of allies with the engine, you'll see it more and more often. And that's this idea of playing pawn at g6, which might seem very weird, but you are threatening to take on h7 to get a promoted past pawn, or even gf7 to weaken the king. And if they do take the pawn, say hg6, well, it kind of allows you to take, and we sort of see now that with this g-file blocked, that gf3 is a lot less effective when after bishop f6 you don't have a rook g2 or an fg2 and knight h3 mate ideas. So it's a very effective example of how to neutralize the opponent's attack by basically doing a blocker on the g-file. A very creative idea. It's quite unique to Crazyhouse and is almost study-like in that regard. Well, instead I played bishop f6, but it's just good, but you have to follow it up precisely as white, and white didn't manage to win the game. I think that here, actually, this is a position, if you do want to try and figure out how to defend, I think this is a good moment to pause video and see if you can play better than white did in the game. So at this point, white played the move bishop to g5, which actually turns out to be a decisive mistake. Actually, the idea of putting the pawn at g6 probably works even here, because even though you're sacking a piece, you are getting this knight at h5, and we sort of see, well, that black's threats are not so serious compared to white's, and if you do try something like knight h3, trying to, let's say, sack a piece to get a tempo, well, after queen to g5, I think that after bishop g3 that white seems to be holding here, because if you take on h5, white does have a knight f6 drop to get the queen, and otherwise, well, knight f6 is still a very big threat that's not so easy for black to stop, because gf7 or gh7 is still a threat. Obviously, it's still very complicated, and I have a feeling that cren might still have won it anyway, but at least it makes the game a lot more messy, and, well, it means that there now white is also getting a very strong initiative, actually more so than black. kind of surprising how safe the white king is because of knight e2 being covered here. Anyway, the game saw bishop at g5, and the problem with bishop at g5, I should point out that knight h5 and then pawn at g6 is also very good. But after bishop g5, black now found a very nice combination, playing the move of g takes f3, where he kind of realized that if white does play bishop takes it, you've got knight h3, and then you have the mate with king h1 and f takes g2, so I think this is what white overlooked when playing bishop at g5. And after knight at e4, actually black defended very, very strongly at this point. He kind of realized that the queens by themselves are not very good attackers, so he played the move queen takes g5, and actually sacrificed the queen in order to get the decisive attack with fg2, and, well, there's just so many threats against the white position, whereas the black king is just very safe without a good check in hand for white. Like knight f6 would be really great for white, but he doesn't have a knight in the hand. The game went bishop e4. Black played rook g5, not going for all the material, which would also be fine, but instead going for mate with knight h3. White played the move bishop takes c6, and after bc6 he kind of went for this desperate attack with knight at f6. But it turns out white doesn't have enough material in hand, or after queen at e8. Again, it's a theme I mentioned many times in my videos, that basically the queen by itself is not a very good attacker. You need other pieces to back it up. And we see out here as well that pawn at e5 doesn't really lead anywhere after the king moves. And if queen f3 check, then bishop at f5 kept everything safe. After queen d8, pawn at e7, black was just dropping the pieces on the board to defend the king. And after pawn at e5 and king g6, white resigned here because black is going to play knight h3, win the queen by force, and then at that point a queen drop on h4 is going to lead to a very quick mate. And actually, it's probably even a faster mate, like knight at e2 mate after knight h3, queen takes h3. So yeah, it's a very nice example showing some very typical attacking ideas for black in these French structures with knight f6, gf6. So I think this game can be quite inspiring, and, well, if you learned something new from the video, make sure to leave a like, and consider subscribing as well to stay up to date with more of this chess content on Crazyhouse and other chess games. So that being said, I'll see you in the next video, Crazyhouse chess fans.